everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I would like to begin a series of videos where I'll be talking on the history of the Crusades. While the Crusades are popular, there have been a lot of misconceptions of them from all sides, whether it be from Muslims and Christians who seek to shift all the blame onto the other for the events, or from atheists who overly emphasize the religious aspects of the Crusades, and don't bring up the politics and other factors that come into play. Generally, people when I ask what they know about the Crusades, they either know nothing at all, or just repeat a common line of thought that the Crusades were just a series of holy wars against Islam led by power-hungry popes and fought by religious barbaric fanatics. This is a simple story, and as a simple story, it contains some elements of truth to it, but it doesn't include everything. To begin with, while it is of course true that religion played a major factor in the Crusades as they were fighting over Holy Land, there is more to it than just that. The Crusades were a direct response to Muslim conquest of Christian lands, them taking control of 2/3 of the Christian world, and Muslim expansion, and later on became about defending Europe itself. Now, while this may sound like this makes the Crusades a completely defensive wars, and to a good extent they were, it also can't be denied that the Crusades were also acts of aggression on the Christians' behalf, as they wanted to expand power for themselves. Over the course of this series, I hope to delve into all the Crusades and tell what conclusions my research has led me to. This is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I will be talking about the First Crusades. The events of the First Crusades were triggered by the concern Eastern Christians had over the Muslim conquest of the Christian Asia Minor. The Byzantine Christians' loss in the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 helped start the Crusades as the Byzantine wanted Western Christians to help avenge the loss. Now, while there certainly was this response to Muslim conquest, it would be mistaken to say that there was this consistent conflict between Christians and Muslims during the entire time frame, and in fact the expansion had slowed a bit by the time the First Crusades happened. In fact, when you compare the conflicts during that time with really any of the other surrounding nations, find the amount of conflict was average with its highs and lows at certain points, and it was the fact that Muslims had control over Jerusalem for such a long period and were expanding that really got Christians up in arms, and they initially they seeked to see this as a defensive situation, but ended up using it also to extend their authority. So while you could say it was a bit defensive, they capitalized and made it an excuse to be aggressive. In 1184, when the Crusades had been done and battles had been taking place, it was noted by Muslim pilgrim Ibn Jabir that even during battles it wasn't uncommon to see Christians and Muslim travelers pass by the battlefield together and be allowed to trade and engage in business with one another over goods and services in their respective lands without being hampered at all. Historians have speculated that the commerce or business interactions are big reasons why the jihads were so lenient, as making them stricter would be bad economically. It wasn't until around 1186 when Saladin survived a serious illness that he began doing more holy wars of jihad. Before then he had only participated in 11 months of that, but he engaged in over 33 months of targeting Muslims for their land, showing he felt that was more of a thing he should be doing. During the First Crusades, Pope Urban II had fought hard to get the level of power he had at the time, and was still in the recovery period during his time. He had flirted with Pope Gregory VII's idea of sanctifying wars and building a papal army. The First Crusades began when the Pope sought to protect Christian Byzantium from attacking Muslims. Thomas Asbridge, in his book The Crusades, The Authoritative History of the War for the Holy Land, said the following regarding Pope Urban II's motivations. Urban recognized that developing the idea of an expedition to aid Byzantium offered a chance not only to defend Eastern Christendom and improve relations with the Greek Church, but also to reaffirm and expand Rome's authority and to harness and redirect the destructive velocity of Christians living happening in the Latin West. This grand scheme would be launched as a part of a broader campaign to extend the reach of the papal influence beyond the confines of Central Europe into Urban's birthplace and home. So while religion no doubt came into play, politics was also a factor. In protecting the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, the Pope hoped to expand Rome's authority and gain Christian allies in the West. Just like the secular counterparts of today, in war situation, protection comes with a cost, and the Pope wasn't going to do these series of wars if he felt he wasn't going to get something out of it, and expanding the papacy is definitely one benefit he sought. Originally with his demonization sermons, the Pope only expected to get a couple thousand to join him, but he ended up getting over to 40 to 60,000 men. The Pope did show signs of corruption, as he did tell lies about the damage Islam was doing and dehumanized Muslims so he could rally up his army and encourage them to fight, and arguably you could say the Pope came to believe these lies. Now, I've been harping on the Pope, but Muslims weren't exactly innocent in this with their expansion and fighting in wars. The Abbasid dynasty, which came into place in 750 AD after a bloody coup which overthrew the previous Umayyad ruling dynasty, gradually led to Sunni and Shia strands of Islam separating, thus breaking them as the monolithic Islamic state they once were. So there was plenty of infighting going on. Once the Turks, aka Central Asia nomadic tribesmen, came into play in 1040, they became known for their warlike behavior, and they would howl like wolves and rain down arrows on their enemies, and would at times kill anyone, even the infants, the girls, and the old people. And later on, Turkish warlord Zengin became known for his brutality, and his taking over the western settlement of Odyssia made Christians do the Second Crusades. Zengin was a champion warrior, although Zengin would not be enough, as in 1099 with the siege of Jerusalem, the Christians won. The Christian Crusaders put them all to the sword and took Jerusalem, and this was arguably the most successful crusade of any of the Crusades that happened, which we'll be going over in later videos, and I'll explain more in more details then. And I could go on a whole video about him myself, and I will do so in the third installment, where I'll be tackling the Second Crusades and what Zengin and others participated in. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, I am Mr. Brass, and today we're going to be talking about the Second Crusades. The Second Crusades were done because of Zengin's taking over of the western settlement of Odyssia, and it was far more political than the first and needed two kings, King Louis VII and King Conrad III of Germany, a French abbot named Bernard, and an exiled pope named Eugenius III in order to really rally up people to get the Crusades going. The pope's papal bull indeed made terms for what the church was expecting to get out of it, and the volunteer system would be back in place along with others. It expanded on the religious principles of the First Crusades, though. Contrary to popular opinion, the Crusades weren't all stupid, poor, religiously fanatic barbarians fighting each other, and in fact, many of them were wealthy, well-educated men who took financial hits just so they could help their fellow Christians and gain spiritual fame. Zengin was brought up before, and it can't be brought up how he really did a number on Christians, and he became known as a destroyer of heretics and as a jihad warrior. Now, with all that said, there is little evidence to say that he took the wars as seriously as one may think. While he was a jihad warrior, he was more interested in presenting himself as a ruler of all of Islam. He would be killed at the age of 62 in his bed. Nur el-Din would take over, and like Zengin, jihad against Christians wasn't his primary focus, and he was more concerned with gaining control of Damascus, and was content with having Christians around with some control over the land, if it meant they could act as a useful buffer with people he disagreed with, and they didn't get in his way. While he was initially warlike like Zengin, he became more forgiving over time and put more rules of combat in place. he would join forces with other Muslim leaders in order to defeat the Crusaders at the siege of Damascus in 1148, thus ending the Second Crusades. Well, this is all for now. I'll see you in the next installment where we'll go into the Third Crusades. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there, this is Mr. Brass, and today we will be talking about the Third Crusades. The Third Crusades were inspired by the Sultan of Egypt, Saladin, defeating the Crusader king of Jerusalem in the Battle of Hadin in 1187 during a jihad military campaign, which got guys like the famous Richard the Lionheart involved. Saladin would use jihad to try to unite Muslims, and he would present Christians in a bad light, similar to what Pope Urban II did with Muslims in the First Crusades. Saladin was known for his impressive military strategies, which emphasized military might and political manipulation, which was in some ways similar to Nur al-Din, whom he disagreed with due to Nur's greed for Egyptian money. Within months of getting into a position of power, he brutally suppressed a Christian military revolt. The death of his uncle and Nur did much to help him maintain power by not constraining him to someone else's will. In 1177, Saladin launched an opportunistic military campaign against the Christians of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, taking advantage of King Baldwin IV's leprosy, and because his men were already ready for an attack and decided to just go out and affirm his commitment to the Holy War, but in the end he would end up losing the battle at Gizzard, which left him humiliated and his reputation somewhat tarnished. Baldwin's decision to confront Saladin was seen as foolish by some, but Baldwin maintained he did so because he knew his people would suffer if he didn't. Saladin would make foolish decisions like heavily relying on his family in matters of government, rather than selecting based on merit, which gave him problems. It wasn't until his victory at the siege of Jacob's Ford when he got his credit back. Funny enough, no less than a year later, the Christians and the Muslims signed a 2-year truce so Saladin could focus on securing his position and his authority over Muslims. This is a common trend in these things where Muslims and Christians would fight each other for a while, but then just take a break. Really, Saladin only increased his effort for jihad in the Holy War since after he had ran ill in 1186. It is still discussed whether or not he pursued these holy wars to actually widen the interest of Islam, or if he was doing it just so he could gain power and glory. That's not to say Saladin wasn't a true Muslim or wasn't a committed Muslim as people may think I'm saying, but merely is that while he was a very religious man, he had other interests, such as political interest, that kept up his time. Muslims really were more focused on defending their orthodoxy than fighting holy wars, and even when Saladin launched an offensive attack against Christian Palestine in 1183, that was more in order to get back at them for Reynard of Chatillon's expedition of the Red Sea, but since the other Christians really weren't aware of this attack, they treated Saladin's attack on them as on a defensive level. Even then, it was clear that the jihad was of secondary importance to Saladin. When you analyze the regions where the jihad took place during this time of the 1180s, you get areas of Transjordan and Galilee, which all had economic, political, and strategic benefits for Saladin. In fact, his commitment to the jihad was pretty much questioned, and Saladin would have to do things like wage wars on Outremer in order to keep his religious rep up on the Crusades. Saladin would score a major victory at the Battle of Hadin at 1187, which resulted in him capturing the king of Lezungian and noted enemy Reynard of Chatillon, killing Reynard by beheading him. He'd enjoy more victories after this due to the now more exposed vulnerability of the Christian forces. Saladin, despite showing great brutality in the war, it is also worth noting he can't be dismissed as simply a barbarian, as when the siege of Jerusalem happened in 1187 and Jerusalem was surrendered over to him, he was willing to negotiate a deal with Christians in order to preserve Muslim lives. With the Battle of Hadin at 1187 and the siege of Jerusalem, Christians in the area were enraged, and of the and were in desperate need of a champion, which came in the form of Richard the Lionheart, and a third crusade was put into place. Richard the Lionheart led an army to challenge Saladin and defeated him at the Battle of Arsef, and eventually, after getting the city of Jaffa, Richard would get Saladin to sign a peace treaty in 1192, and thus their third crusade ended. Now, while Richard may seem like he was this perfect warrior, it must be recognized that Richard was not without his faults, as he did have a reputation as being arrogant, which I'd say comes with the territory of having a cult of personality around you. During his lifetime, people made fantastical stories about him and how awesome he was, and he obviously wasn't going to dispel these stories. Richard also struggled to reconcile duties and obligations between creating a legend in Palestine and defending the Western realm. There was at one point much negativity about Richard and his reign, such as that he wasn't really a good king and took advantage of people, but nowadays he's generally given a good light as information has came up showing he had his hands full during a lot of his reign. It is also well to know that despite his arrogance, Richard the Lionheart's win was of secondary nature, as he never actually succeeded in recapturing Jerusalem, but was simply able to gain a foothold in Jerusalem. Well, that is all for today, and can't wait to see you for the next installment where we will be talking the Fourth Crusades. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we'll be talking about the Fourth Crusades. The Fourth Crusade was originally brought by Pope Innocent III in his want to recapture Jerusalem. He felt it was his divine calling and that the limited control Richard the Lionheart gave wasn't enough. Originally the plan was to go through Egypt first, and after that was done, target Jerusalem, but it never made it to that point, as Crusaders ended up attacking the Christian city of Constantinople because of numerous political and financial issues. Innocent's way of going about doing the Crusades was flawed from the get-go, as he didn't rely on secular forces as other Crusades had done, although secular forces did become a big factor in this crusade. As stated before, political turmoil along with financial issues was a major cause for the events of the Crusades. Funny enough, the only reason why the Crusaders were in Constantinople to begin with was because they had been invited by Alexios IV. Alexios wanted them to help him reclaim his rightful spot to the throne and promised them money in return and in exchange, which is something that they needed, seeing how they had to pay off a debt for the large amount of Venice naval ships they had and didn't need. An anti-Western faction had gathered significant allies, which led to the slaughtering of a lot of people in Constantinople. This created a need for revenge, which played a major factor in future conflicts. Like mentioned before, Crusaders wanted to pay back a debt for naval ships they got from Venice. Venice higher-ups pretty much told them, hey, if you take over the Christian city of Zadar, that will help pay back your debt, and while some Crusaders refused to attack fellow Christians, many Crusaders obviously did. The Venice people had a long tension with the Byzantine emperor and population in general, as they were thought to be entitled rich guys, and their criticism of the Byzantine emperor's conquest resulted in Emperor Emmanuel I locking Venetians in the area into prisons, which would lead to massive slaughters amongst each other over time. Once Constantinople's populace under the anti-Western ruler Mursiphilus killed Alexios IV, the Mursiphilus refused to honor Alexios' agreement to the Crusaders and sought to destroy them. The Crusaders realized they weren't going to get paid for the work they had done, and this would be the final nail in the coffin. In an act of revenge, they decided to sack Constantinople and justified the killing of a large number of Christians by saying that they had been taken over by corrupt people anyway. Despite being threatened with excommunication from the Pope, the Crusaders still did it. This Fourth Crusade mainly helped to divide off the major Christian groups, and it showed Pope Innocent III's failure to establish control from Rome. Pope Innocent III didn't like how out of the control the Fourth Crusades was, but tried to roll with it and re-establish power, and began simply going after people that were deemed heretics, like Cathars. And his want to widen the Holy War became clear. He allowed untrained men into the war, rather than like before before with only allowing trained men in, and had refined and expanded indulgences to mean that you could pay for God's forgiveness even without crusading. This was likely done for financial reasons, but nonetheless this would result in the church being criticized for being corrupt for many generations. Pope Innocent's goals exceeded the authority he had and were unrealistic and not well thought out. He died shortly after putting the Fourth Crusades in place, and on top of all that, his vestment, aka garments, were stolen by looters on his deathbed. Well, that is all for today, and I can't wait to see you for the next installment where we'll be talking about the Fifth Crusade. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we will be going through the Fifth Crusade. The Fifth Crusade can be grouped into some of the last crusades that happened. The Fifth Crusade was put into motion by Pope Innocent III in 1213, just 3 years before his death in 1216. It was planned as an entire church-based affair, which again would try to go after Muslim Egypt. Pope Innocent would really try to increase incentives by not just offering indulgences, but also immunity from all taxes and forgiveness of all debts to people that participated in the Crusades. Saladin's nephew, Al-Kamil, was given control over Egypt by his father, Al-Aldin, after a civil war which was caused by Saladin's heirs fighting for control of Saladin's Abbad lands. King Frederick II of Germany was arguably the best guy they had on the Crusade in terms of mindset, although he did delay his departure due to his political conflicts, and he never actually made it to Diomedes, where the battles were really going on. For about 2 years it was mostly monarchy, aka government ran with church involvement, being limited to an extent by Cardinal Pelagius, who would get involved and gradually take charge of the crusade. Cardinal Pelagius would be practically given the opportunity to have Jerusalem back twice by offers from Al-Kamil, but he turned them down, which ended up costing him and lowered morale in support of fellow crusaders. After the first rejection, that made the crusaders angry, as they seen Jerusalem as their most important target. The crusaders did manage to occupy a port at Diomedes, despite the cardinal's perceived irrational mind, but overall this would not last, as when they marched to Cairo, the Nile had flooded and trapped them and left them unable to really retreat. They were forced to surrender to Al-Kamil and his united brothers in 1221, and an 8-year truce was signed, where they would give up Diomedes in exchange for their lives. This was ultimately looked at as the best of circumstances for Al-Kamil, as he understood that had King Frederick's army had appeared at Diomedes, that would endanger Egypt, and he had already had enough to worry about with his family trying to overthrow him. While he was criticized for not really engaging in a decisive holy war, jihad, against crusaders, it didn't seem like Al-Kamil was that much into them anyway. It was more focused on keeping his power in check, and not keeping Jerusalem was pretty much something he really was able to do, and he offered up Jerusalem multiple times. Well, that is all for today. Can't wait to see you guys in the next installment where we'll be talking about the Sixth Crusade. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there, I am Mr. Brass, and today I will be telling you about the Sixth Crusade. You can't really talk about the Sixth Crusade without talking about King Frederick II. Historians are divided on what to make of him. Was he a ruthless dictator or a genius? King Frederick II, while he decided to take up the cross, he ended up taking his sweet time actually going to battle. More than 10 years with no action. In fact, it took him so long that Pope Gregory IX actually excommunicated him, and it wasn't until after his excommunication that he went crusading, but even then, but with the way he went about crusading even after being excommunicated, that would put him in conflict with Pope Gregory. Once he got the lands of Jerusalem, that put the Pope and him at each other's throats, and it was feared King Frederick would take the papacy lands and threaten their positions. King Frederick had legit reasons for not going right away into battle, such as being plagued with illness, but that didn't stop the Pope's judgment. Because of the excommunication, he gathered mixed opinions from his fellow man. Now, some people will bring up that because he was excommunicated and he had a rivalry with the Pope, that he obviously wasn't a devout Christian, which is absurd. King Frederick was a very devout man, but just happened to go against the Pope. King Frederick criticized the excessive involvement of the Pope in secular politics and said that the church should just run things spiritually. When his tomb was opened up in 1782, what can be found on his left shoulder was the Crusader cross, showing he never forgot his crusade and his mission for Christ. Now, with that out of the way, one can point out, however, that really what he was going after in the 1220s was to extend his imperial power, along with getting Jerusalem back. There is also no doubt that he could play politics good, and it was noticed by Al-Kamil, the Sultan of the time, and Al-Kamil struck up a deal with him that he would have Jerusalem if he could simply promise not to launch a crusade on Egypt. This was a smart move politically because Al-Kamil knew that King Frederick would do whatever he could to make tensions worse between Al-Kamil and his brothers who were fighting over Saladin's lands. Frederick managed to go through a relatively peaceful negotiation with Al-Kamil in 1229 after showing he could match and perhaps surpass Al-Kamil in military strategy. He would agree to allow Muslims to be able to have their holy sites and certain privileges to go along with the land. Al-Kamil at the time, who merely cared more about trading relations with Christians than waging a bloody jihad war, was pretty good with these conditions. The treaty would end a decade later though, and Muslims would regain control of the land. Al-Kamil would initially take a political hit for conceding the lands to the Christians, but Al-Kamil just assured that he would just clear them out once the truce ended. A lot of the conflict with King Frederick and Pope Gregory IX was political, and it was recognized as such in Europe. There is much merit to the idea that it was political because the Pope felt that the union of the Holy Roman Empire with the Kingdom of Sicily was unacceptable, as it seemed to put the papacy at an inferior role. Now, funny enough, while there was this conflict, most of King Frederick throughout his entire career tried to compromise with the Pope and did not defy his place at the head of the church. Well, that is all for today. See you in the next installment where we'll be talking about the 7th Crusade. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, I am Mr. Brass, and today we will be talking about the 7th Crusade. The 7th Crusade was a holy war sanctioned by King Louis IX against Egypt from the years 1248 to 1254. Louis wanted to conquer Egypt so he could use it as a base from which he could get Jerusalem back, which had fallen to the Muslims in 1244. Louis had suffered from an illness the same year, which had played a motivation in this decision. He took 4 years to prep for the war and make sure everything was ready to go. This crusade was a loss to Louis, as he lost a major battle, aka the Battle of Mansoura, which reduced his numbers to such a point it made further attacks on Cairo not an option. King Louis was lucky to survive, as he had been captured, but a revolt by the Mamluks, aka slave soldiers of Islam, got him released. While Mamluks seemed like they had been such great friends of the Christians, they would become their worst enemies and their fiercest opponents. After almost 150 years of defeats, Crusaders and Christians alike began doubting their faiths and their missions. Louis was able to establish a permanent French garrison afterward though, so it wasn't a complete loss. Well, that is all for today. Can't wait to see you for the next installment where we'll be talking about the 8th Crusade. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we'll be talking about the 8th Crusades. The 8th Crusades was a holy war sanctioned by once again King Louis IX, who did it in response to the Sultan Baybar's conquering the prominent land of Antioch in 1268. Mamluks had shown their power by fending off the pagan Mongols, who were arguably as brutal, if not more brutal than them. Mamluks were so deadly that Christians initially were trying to create an alliance with the Mongols until they realized their brutality and unwillingness to cooperate. Baybar, unlike the sultans before him, wasn't willing to compromise or hold back in the name of trade and sought to get rid of the Christians. The only thing that really held him back was a worry of the Mongols. By the 1260s, Christian crusaders were in a weakened state and were confined to a mere coastal strip, and Baybar had very little to worry about overall. King Louis did the crusade, but too much of a disagreement of his council emerged, who all thought that King Louis more or less should have learned his lesson from his last try. Like always, he prepared and financed for the war, but instead of going to Palestine, he went to Tunis, where he sought to attack it, but it never came, as he and many of his men fell ill and died, never actually making it to Jerusalem. King Louis died in 1270, and due to his son being ill himself, Louis's brother Charles of Anjou quickly ended what his brother started by making a treaty with Tunis the same year, which benefited the crown financially. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we'll be talking about the 9th Crusade. The 9th Crusade was caused by the same attack at Antioch in 1268, and this time Edward I of England took the run at going at Acre with a small fleet of 15 ships. He wasn't satisfied with taking the money like Charles of Anjou was. The Christians did have some success as they got the victory at the siege of Tripoli and destroyed Baybar's Mamluk ships in 1271. Edward realized that given the Mamluk size, further offensive war would be stupid and decided to strike a 10-year treaty with Baybar, which was dubbed the Treaty of Caesarea. Edward decided to stay behind to make sure the treaty held and would almost be assassinated by a man who broke into his home with a knife, but he'd end up fighting off the man and killing him. He'd eventually head back to England once he felt he did all he could. After Sultan Al-Mansur Qalaman conquered and destroyed Tripoli in 1289 in a battle with the Crusaders, and 2 years later, after he died, his son Al-Ashef Kali took over and put what many historians argue the last nail in the coffin of the Crusades with the siege of Acre in 1291, and basically the whole of Palestine was at the hands of Muslims. Sure, minor crusades were done afterward with limited goals, but not really anything meaningful, and efforts for the Crusades diminished in the 16th century with the Reformation and the declining power of the Pope's authority which came from that. There would still be trading going on with Europe and the Near East for a long time after that, but overall the 9th Crusades marked one of the final moments of the Crusades. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, I am Mr. Brass, and today we'll be talking about the impact of the Crusades. The impact of the Crusades has a weird history in of itself. The Middle Ages experienced an increase in learning, technology, and in international commerce, and the Crusades played a good role in trading. This arguably played a hand in the coming of the scientific revolution. By the 17th century, with all the scientific advancements in Europe wealth and power, it all multiplied, and Islam was seen as just a backward culture by comparison. A bad side of the Christian front is that the Crusades were militaristically mostly a failure, as they couldn't hold on to the Holy Land, and they couldn't stop Muslim expansion. The victories they did get in the Crusades, for the most part, could be attributed to the fact it wasn't until later Crusades that Muslims were more united, and there wasn't as much of a split between the Sunnis and the Shias in the world. Christians who see those these losses, rationed was God cursing them for their sins, as they had a war theology similar to that of the ancient Jews. Also, far from being poor barbarians, many crusaders were wealthy men who lost a lot of money in order to leave their home and combat Muslim expansion on unknown land to them. Indulgences served as a crucial role in this participation in the Crusades, as many felt that killing was sinful, and they also wanted to be forgiven for their sins that they had committed beforehand so they could get into heaven. Well, that is all for today. The next installment will be the final video of the Crusade series. That is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today this will be the last video of the Crusades series where I'll be clearing up misconceptions about the Crusades and telling you the conclusions I've drawn from it. While we like to think on the Muslim side of the wars against Christians that they were jihad, aka holy war based, but in reality that's more of the 8th century ideas, and by the time of the First Crusades, jihad more or less came to be about battling others of the orthodoxy of Islam rather than engaging in holy wars with Christians, and in fact it wasn't until the later Crusades where jihad became more holy war based and it became more physical in place. To show how jihad was more on a spiritual level at times, after the Third Crusades it was common for military rulers to focus on more religious teachings to people. Muslims' perception of the Crusades really didn't mean as much as Jerusalem wasn't like principled power land to them or an economic hotspot to them. People were uninterested in recording such battles with the Crusaders, and when they did, a bias could often be seen. Sure, Jerusalem held spiritual worth, but it's not like Jerusalem was an economic center. Christians themselves didn't go in with the hopes of converting Muslims to Christianity, and were mainly trying to expand, defend, and recover land. With the little interest in recording military events, the Crusades were very much not widespread talked about in the Islamic world. In the medieval Muslim ages, it was considered a war Muslims triumphed over Christians with, and was seen as a largely irrelevant conflict. Muslims forgot about the Crusades, and it stayed that way until the 19th century, and the first history of it in the Arab language wasn't brought in until the 1898 book entitled Splendid Accounts in the Crusading Wars by the Egyptian scholar Sayyid Ali al-Ahari. Even in the 19th century, information of the Crusades was mainly known only by Muslim intellectuals. It wasn't until the 20th century where it really picked up because Europeans collapsed the Ottoman Empire and brung a distorted and notoriously anti-Catholic view of the Crusades. 18th century Enlightenment works from Edward Gibbon and Voltaire gained widespread use in spurting this poor history, as the men were notoriously anti-clerical and believed the war to be a bunch of superstitious nonsense. The Europeans were depicted as barbarians who sought destruction on Muslims, and this history of bad history has impacted our relations with the Middle East for the worse, with men like Osama bin Laden bringing up the Crusades for comparisons of military wars with the USA. So before relatively recently, there was really no sense of the Muslims thinking Crusaders had aggressed war on them, or that the Christians had to pay back atrocities in the Crusades. Overall, the Crusades were a very interesting time to me, and it is sad to see that many people have a poor understanding of the history of these times. I hope my video series has been helpful and have gained my viewers knowledge of these times, and they can know a thing or two about the Crusades. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.